Hello and welcome to this event held by the Imperial War Museum Institute, which works to increase public understanding of war and conflict. The Imperial War Museum's partner in this is the peacebuilding NGO Conciliation Resources, which has worked for more than 25 years to help bring peace around the world. This debate today is part of a broader series titled Reimagining Victory, held to mark the 75th anniversary of VE Day. Let me introduce the debate. Cyber war is a threat to peace. Now I'd like to introduce the speakers. So speaking for the motion, we have Kim Zetter, an award-winning American investigative journalist and author who covers cybersecurity and national security. She's the author of Countdown to Zero Day, Stuxnet, and the launch of the world's first digital weapon. Speaking against the motion, we have Thomas Rid, a political scientist best known for his work on the history and risks of IT in conflict. He's Professor of Strategic Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and his most recent book was Active Measures, The Secret History of Disinformation and Political Warfare. Kim, you're going to open proposing the motion for us.
Okay, so I have 4 arguments that I want to cite for the motion, which is that cyber warfare, or offensive operations, let's call them, are a threat to peace. And the first point that I want to make is that cyber warfare or offensive operations lower the bar for attacks. Nations and entities, non-state entities who wouldn't ordinarily have the resources or the means to launch a military scale attack or to launch a destructive kind of attack, that bar is lowered for them. And so the entry level for a lot more actors is opened, and that potentially then raises the possibility for destabilization in scenarios where actors might not in the past have considered an attack because they didn't have an army, or they didn't have military, or they didn't have that anonymity that cyber attacks bring, might engage in this kind of activity and thus increase the opportunity for more conflict. Second point that I wanted to make is because of the anonymity nature, or the potential anonymity, not all attacks can be attributed, and not every actor is capable of attributing attacks, don't have the capabilities of like the NSA. What that does is it opens the possibility for more false flag operations, and it raises the possibility for third-party actors who want to sort of stoke the fires of an unstable peace between 2 other actors. So let's say Pakistan and India have this unsettled peace for years, and if someone might want to tip the balance and launch an attack that's posed as one of those actors, it can kindle a fire that previously wouldn't have existed. The other point that I want to make is the interconnectivity of all systems. Because we can't always assess the risks and potential consequences of an attack, attacks can have reverberations and potentially cause collateral damage to hospital systems, to banking systems, to other critical infrastructure. And because you have that capability, an attack that wasn't intended to, let's say, go into all-out warfare could potentially lead to that from the fallout with a reaction. The other point that I wanted to make was about the muddying, I think, between espionage and warfare. When you've got offensive operations like this, something that might start out as something that we would categorize as simple espionage normally in the past, can very quickly escalate to something beyond that if you cause destruction of a system unintentionally, or if someone is engaged in what we call active defense, which is hacking back, then it has the potential to escalate something that ordinarily would have been just kind of an espionage activity into something that's more destructive. And also just the potential for the hack and dumps with emails and other information and disinformation. It also raises the possibility of a traditional attack or traditional espionage then escalating into some kind of warfare. And those were the 4 points that I wanted to make.
Thank you very much. Thomas.
Yeah, the conversation about cyber war, about computer network attacks is an old conversation. We've seen the phenomenon of government hacking each other for 25 years, and the conversation about this phenomenon has started more than half a century ago. So there's really no need, I think, to spike the conversation with terms like potential, and because we have a rich history to study. So I'm just going to quickly make 3 observations. The first one is that cyber war is a term that originated in the 1980s and 1990s, and it is the dystopian equivalent to internet utopianism that I think is a well familiar phenomenon. While, I'll simplify, in Silicon Valley, you saw people getting really excited about the possibilities of cyberspace, to use another dated term. In the 1990s, you had in the Beltway on the East Coast, in Washington and around Washington, the concern that cyber war could hit the United States very hard and, bring down a highly connected society through blackouts and whatnot. And also you had the negative vision that, or the positive vision, if you like, that wars now could be won without firing a shot, simply through cyber attack. Of course, both the utopian and the dystopian vision never really came to pass. So the conversation has since moved on, and I think Kim's excellent points reflect the progress that has been made since. The second point that I wanted to make is that the term cyber war is really quite counterproductive because it focuses our minds on the wrong questions. It focuses our mind on the question of violence. Was there, how violent or how lethal was an attack? And I think that is actually not an interesting question because the empirical record is not very violent in almost all cases. And the other misleading focus is on military organizations, on armed forces as opposed to criminals, or more importantly, intelligence agencies, which tend to be the main actor here. And of course, they have their own terminology internally. They speak of computer network operations, computer network attack, and computer network exploitation. These terms are much more precise and don't talk about war. And finally, my third observation is about what's a better terminology. And indeed, when we look closely at the phenomena that we see over the past 25 years, we see a continuation of age-old intelligence practice. There is espionage, intelligence collection, first and foremost, against government as well as military, but also commercial targets. And there is what used to be called covert action and still called covert action, call it active measures in the old Soviet terminology, if you like, sabotage, effects, operations for effect. And there are very few of those. The universe of cases there is quite small, something on the order of maybe 20, depending on what you include. And I would just stress here that attribution comes in, and again, Kim already stressed the significance of attribution, because you need to attribute oftentimes to be able to understand not just who is responsible for a specific breach or intrusion or campaign if it's a longer situation, but also you have to do some attribution in order to understand what the nature of the problem is in the first place, what the coherence of the phenomenon is. Are you looking at isolated incidents, or are they maybe connected into a bigger campaign? So attribution and the capability to attribute become a really core feature of the conversation. And I think it's there where we see actual progress in the conversation over the past 5 to 7 years.
Thomas, can I get you to pick up on Kim's second point, which was that the danger that because you can have false flag examples of cyber warfare, then it creates an instability of peace. So she gave the example of Pakistan and India. You could have a third party come in there, which tips the balance. Does that not mean that cyber war is a threat to peace? Why don't you agree with that point?
So if we look at the history of deception, false flag operation, deniable covert action over the decades, of course, we have a very large number of cases that we can look at, study from the Cold War and even from before the Cold War. And they were always designed, these operations, to be deniable, or semi-deniable, even against the face of, even in the face of better evidence. And they were always designed to undermine and bypass deterrence regimes. So these were operations that are precisely designed to be executed and not escalate, because you can just get away with things. And of course, that we see a degree of escalation because we see more of these operations, but we have very few instances, very few cases where they actually spill over into something bigger. So let's take an example. Pecha, the most costly cyber attack in history. These are the words of the NSA official who revealed the attack, who attributed the attack to Russian military intelligence. There were barely any meaningful consequences for the operators. So there was actually, you had this extreme incident, or another incident that Kim is better familiar with than I am, the Stuxnet incident, and there was actually no escalation as a response. So I would simply ask back, what are the instances where we actually see escalation?
Well, obviously you're an expert in Stuxnet, and I would love you to jump in there then, Kim.
Well, I just want to address the actual question was about intervening as a third party between two nations and stoking fires there. I don't know, Thomas, if we have an example of that in sort of past history in conventional warfare or activities where a third country or third party was able to ignite a war between two other parties simply by posing as an attack from another. Does that exist in conventional? Do we have any examples of that?
Great question. I should have a better answer available quickly. I don't. Let me think about this a little more. And yeah,
so the point that I was making was about two countries that already have some hostility between them. And so there's a tinderbox there. And the potential then was for a third actor to come in and with the actual intention, not sort of as a an unintended consequence, but with the actual intention of posing as one of those players and launching an attack that then ignites some kind of international incident between them. And that's what I was referring to in with that escalation. With regard to Stuxnet, I mean, so Thomas is right in terms of what we've seen in the past of activity. We haven't seen anything that sort of raised to the level of escalation. We thought that there would be some kind of escalation with Stuxnet, but it's uneven partners, right? You've got the US and Israel against Iran, which at that point didn't even have cyber capabilities. It was after the discovery of Stuxnet that Iran launched its internal and offensive operation development. So I think that we're still in early days, right? We still haven't seen the full potential of this, and there's still nations are still building up their operations, their capabilities. We don't actually have the capability also of recognizing everything that is a cyber attack. We see a lot of sabotage that goes on with pipelines exploding and military installations exploding, and we don't really know in many cases what is the cause of those. So it's hard to judge really what has resulted in some kind of escalation, but we haven't actually, I mean, he's absolutely right, we haven't seen any kind of cyber attack so far that has then led to what we would normally describe as the level of warfare.
If I may for a moment just argue against my own point, just to make this more interesting. I mean, there is this fascinating phenomenon right now that we have, you can look at Ukraine in 2014 and Russian forces operating there without insignia, sort of anonymously. I mean, it was obvious who we're looking at, but they pretended to be somehow somebody else. You had attacks against the Saudi oil installation with drones that were unattributed. And there are a couple of incidents in the Persian Gulf as well that are unattributed. Now, these are not obviously computer network operations in any way. They're conventional operations, but they seem to follow a logic that we see in the realm of computer network attack.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Of course, it's hard to make that case causally.
Kim, can I ask you to pick up on Thomas's point about saying essentially that the term cyber warfare is counterproductive? Why don't you think that? Why don't you agree with that? What does it tell us that's useful?
I think the problem with the term cyber warfare is that it's misused and it's overused. And so it's become a term that doesn't really have any meaning. People talk about the Russian attack against or targeting of the US election infrastructure as cyber warfare, and that's not cyber warfare. They talk about the attack against the DNC as cyber warfare, and that's not cyber warfare. And so it's really become meaningless. DDoS attacks now are termed cyber attacks and or cyber warfare. So I think that his point is that it's not meaningful and it's lost any kind of usefulness in that regard. He makes the point of, also dividing the kinds of activities more pointedly into the terms that the military uses, like computer network operations, computer network, or sorry, I've forgotten. CNA, CNO, and then the exploitation one, CNE. So I think that a more precision language is more useful. So I agree with that point.
Can I just get you guys, either of you actually, to explain why you said Russian meddling in the US election was not cyber warfare? Can I get you to explain for our viewer why that's the case?
Well, I mean, it's hard to describe why something is not cyber warfare. We look at warfare in traditional terms as some kind of escalated conflict between two nations. And this was a one-sided operation that was intent on doing influence operation, right? Or it's the same kind of thing that we used to see with the CIA intervening in elections elsewhere. So that's what the point that I was making. The fourth one is that this muddies the lines between traditional espionage and traditional intelligence operations and what we consider actual military warfare. And I think that people, just because it takes place in the cyber realm, it feels a little more, I don't like the word scary, but I think to the general public and to lawmakers who don't really understand all of this, and their go-to point automatically is warfare. And they sort of forget to make these connections with past operations and comparisons to actually this is much more like traditional influence operations and the like of that. So that's why I say it's not cyber warfare. Thomas, did you want to?
I would just observe that key actors here, the intelligence community in the United States that attributed the election interference incidents several times and with different levels of detail, the special counsel, Robert Mueller, in their reporting and indictments, the Department of Justice, indeed the White House or the previous White House, or the Obama White House, when they put in place sanctions against Russia, none of them used the word cyber warfare. So it's simply not a word that is used in this case, and I think rightly so. But let's quickly talk about one case that is extremely relevant to this conversation, and that is NotPetya. And specifically a law, NotPetya was a major attack against Ukraine that spiraled out of control and hit a lot of international companies, including Maersk, Merck, and others. But it was so important about this incident is that it caused a lot of damage, financial damage, because the attack damaged production processes and computers and whatnot. And some companies filed for insurance claims. And one major company, or at least actually two major companies that filed for insurance claims, had their claim rejected by Zurich, the reinsurance company, on the basis of a clause that describes that's the warlike action exclusion clause. So basically the clause says we pay for damages unless they were caused by warlike action or some other things like terrorism. And when Zurich saw the indictment come out of the White House saying that, look, this operation was Russian military intelligence, they're like, oh, great, this is, this sounds warlike, let's not pay like $100 million. They're looking at a lot of money here. So terminology has immediate consequences. The case is going to court in the next couple of months.
That's an excellent point, yeah.
I'm
supposed to be disagreeing with him, but I Yeah.
Is there a risk that by hyping up cyber war as a threat, we actually neglect the other risks to peace, the more sort of, I guess, what people would think of as traditional conflicts, so armed conflicts?
When conflict gets very real when people die, and especially when they die, you know, at home, so to speak, that is more immediately has more immediate consequences in democracies, at least. So by definition, I'm not concerned about conflict getting you know, crowded out of the conversation, because it's the most serious situation in politics that we can encounter: war and, you know, death and conflict. So, but I am concerned about the conversation sort of being stuck in this loop that we keep on talking about cyber war, and because it really doesn't help the conversation to advance. So, you know, just to continue with this Zurich example, how should we resolve that question? It's actually a really difficult one. Should Zurich pay? Was it a warlike action? The most effective, costly cyber attack in history, should it be considered warlike action? What do you think, Kim?
No, I mean, it wasn't aimed at a nation. It was it was launched against a company initially, with the idea that it would affect the customers of that company. But it wasn't going after a traditional state target, wasn't going after military target, wasn't even going after critical infrastructure. I think it's an annoyance attack, and potentially they had other motivations behind it, but it still doesn't rise to the level. I mean, it's the same thing with the Russian interference in the election, where Obama gives Russia a warning about interference. I've often wondered what would have happened if Russia didn't heed the warning and continued through with the election. Was the United States prepared to launch some kind of, I don't know, military scale operation, or were they just going to take down the power grid in Russia? It's unclear what the potential consequences of that were. It's unclear how the US regarded it in terms of the level of escalation in its mind. But I don't think the NotPetya attack qualifies as cyber warfare.
I would agree with that. Also, it's in a case like this, it's really important to look at the specifics. So if we look at the NotPetya payload, which is the part of the software that caused the damage through a fake ransomware attack, so by encrypting files on the target computer. And if we look at the propagation mechanism, which is sort of the kind of like the missile that carries a weapon, but that's a bad comparison. The propagation mechanism was basically, it's very hard to tell whether the international targets of NotPetya, the Merck and Maersk and Cadbury and, you know, so many companies that were affected, were actually affected intentionally, or whether it was a mistake on the part of the designers of the tool that they spread out of that they spread inside company networks from their offices in Ukraine, because the target was Ukraine primarily. So you could, I mean, I'm not making the argument, but one could make the argument that the Ukraine targets were actually hit by something warlike, but the international targets not, because the intention wasn't there to hit them in the first place. But that's an interesting conversation to have. And I don't think we get there if we just talk about cyber war.
When this case comes to court, what is your expectation in terms of the result of it? I mean, I'm asking you to look in your crystal ball, which is obviously impossible, but presumably there are laws that they're going to have to interpret that will set out what should be the case. Is this going to set a precedent? I mean, have we ever had a case like this before? And do you expect there will be long-term implications of whichever way it is ruled?
So the case has high significance and will set a precedent. Will set a precedent, for example, we have the situation here that we have a cyber attack. This actually qualifies as a cyber attack, unlike many incidents that are often called cyber attacks, because it had effects. And we have this cyber attack, and the question is, and nobody claimed credit for it, like the Russian government never said it was us. It was a number of governments, the US government, the UK, a couple of their Five Eyes allies, and a few others who blamed Russia. For example, the German government has seen the evidence as well, but decided not to blame Russia in this case. So if Zurich wins this case, and if Zurich basically gets doesn't have to pay because of the Warlike Exclusion Act, then we create this extraordinary precedent that just some government, or perhaps a small group of governments, can simply say, "Oh, this is this other government. I'm not giving you a shred of evidence. The United States has provided zero evidence to implicate Russia. They just said it was Russia, and by doing so, essentially have real monetary consequences in the insurance market without evidence. That's just an unacceptable situation in my mind." And I fully expect the case to be lost by Zurich and won by the companies that go to court against Zurich.
It raises it also politicizes, I think, business operations a bit. We saw this with Sony, where initially it was unclear what kind of attack this was and who was the operator behind Sony, or who was behind the attack against Sony. And there was a lot of focus on, initially after the attack, on Sony's negligence in securing the network. They had been attacked numerous times over the years, and there were reports, internal reports about the lack of security, and that was never addressed. And so Sony was was in a lot of hot water after the attack. And right as they were sort of in that position of trying to defend against their negligence, the US government comes forward and makes an announcement that this was North Korea. And that allows Sony to sort of throw up its hands and say, see, what could we have done? What kind of company has the wherewithal to defend itself against a well-resourced nation state? And so I think that it raises that issue of, it was very suspect when the government came in and the timing of the government, because I remember shortly after that, Obama at the press conference made a statement that we want businesses to know that they're not alone, that the US government is behind them. And so now you've entered this territory of who really is responsible for the defense of private companies if it's not critical infrastructure. Although, as we learned, surprisingly, a motion picture company is actually in a category of critical infrastructure, because the definition of critical infrastructure in the US is about as useful as the definition of cyber warfare. But so it was really interesting that we had this statement coming out from Obama in conjunction with the attribution. We want companies to know that the US government is behind them. They're not alone. They don't stand out there alone. And so it's muddying these kinds of activities now, where it's not a traditional warfare. It's this was a vendetta, potentially by a nation state against a company, but it now enters that category of nation state attack and potentially cyber warfare if we're going to, bandy these terms around loosely.
Also, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Also, we have two types of situations here of attribution. We have cases where we have a lot of publicly available evidence, or sometimes disclosed by governments, or often the Department of Justice in an indictment here in the United States, that implicates specific countries, sometimes individuals, in a specific hack at a, with high confidence and sometimes even with certainty. We have, so these are one type of case. The other cases are attribution claims like the NotPetya claim that do not provide any evidence, but still make a claim, just simply saying, with a 5-line press release, we think it's, or not we think, but this is Russian military intelligence. So for people like jurors, judges, scholars like me, journalists like Kim, the public writ large, the question really is, what should we do with these evidence-free attribution claims, especially when they come from governments? Should we simply believe governments because they're governments? And That's a tough question. I would personally lean towards no, because governments tend to get it wrong sometimes. These are consequential cases. So we can't just simply rely on the word of a government that doesn't want to reveal its sources. And I will add that in the NotPetya case, the story is even more complicated because it involves, for complicated reason, a disclosure of an NSA operation and of an NSA leak that was highly embarrassing, that the White House very conveniently never mentioned explicitly in that context. So they're not a disinterested third party here.
Thank you both very much. We've actually come to the end of the time. So thank you to Kim, and thank you to Thomas, and thank you to the Imperial War Museum and Conciliation Resources.
Thank you.
Thank you.